All right, we're ready to begin with chapter one for human anatomy. And in this first chapter, it's truly an introduction to just the basic terminology for life and for anatomy. So we'll go ahead and move forward. And starting out with just simply the definition of what we're studying. So, anatomy, or in our purpose, of course, it's human anatomy. Anatomy is a subject of a life science of biology. And this is, of course, related to now the structure of an organism. And you see that as the key term. So, truly, the structure, the physical makeup is what we're studying in this class. And the way that we learn anatomy is through dissection. So, truly separating, dissecting the various organs, bones, ligaments, all these features of an organism. And we'll be learning, of course, their name. So, the names for all of these body parts. We'll see their location within the body, the relationship between these structures. So, how are they connected to one another? And it's all of these different features, their position, their interconnection and relationship, their structure, both at the chemical level all the way up to the level of the large scale gross anatomy. And truly, all of that comes together in the study of structure, the study of anatomy. And this is a very, very old subject with a lot of terminology based in Greek and Latin terms. So, some examples of different forms of anatomy. And we notice here at the microscopic scale, meaning that we need a microscope to magnify and observe these very tiny structures. And two examples of microscopic anatomy would be cytology. And this is truly now the microanatomy of cells. So, learning the structure and features of various unique types of cells. And this will be covered in the lectures for this course. So, we'll be studying cytology of many different specific types of cells. Whereas histology, the term histology truly means study of tissues, and still at the microscopic level. Well, tissues themselves are now collections of cells and their extracellular material. And that's what we would use the microscopes for, to study the microscopy, studying the histology of tissues. Whereas now the gross anatomy, and here are just some examples, there's many more. This is now the large scale form of studying anatomy. So we do not need magnification. Just with our eyes, we could see bones and muscles that are dissected. So here's a few examples, but truly the important one for us here is systemic anatomy. This is what our class covers. And we'll continue here with these. So these are just some of the forms of gross anatomy. This first one, surface anatomy, just like the name implies, this is what you see right at the surface of the body. So we don't need any type of dissection, any type of magnification. And we know just in general the shape of a human body, right? We have our head that's above our neck, our torso, and we have our arms and legs. And even on our face, the position of our eyes, which are above our nose and mouth. So just the general appearance. You can see your skin, your hair, your nails, and the basic structure of the body right at the surface. Regional anatomy, this is a more in-depth level of anatomy. And as an example, how is this now different from our class? Regional anatomy, we would learn the complete anatomical detail of just some specific part of the body. So for example, if you were studying, I have this example here for the arm, learning all of the complete anatomy of that isolated body part. So meaning learning, of course, the bones of the arm, the muscle, the blood vessels, the nerves, all collectively. And this is a more advanced level of study. Whereas our class, the anatomy for systemic approach, the body is divided into 11 distinct organ systems. So we're just going to focus on one organ system at a time, but we'll study that complete organ system as it relates to the entire body. So back here in regional anatomy, I gave the example of learning the bones of the arm, along with all the other muscles and blood vessels and nerves. But for systemic anatomy, we would just learn all of the bones, the entire skeleton, all throughout the entire body. And then once we finish that one system, then we'll move on to another system. So this is a great way to introduce students to anatomy. And that's, of course, what this class is. So as an example of this gross anatomy, here's just a figure from our textbook, and later on we'll have models and anatomical charts that show this detail of the eye. So just learning the various features. You've probably heard of a cornea, retina before, some common terms. This is a large-scale gross anatomy. Histology, using the microscopes to study the eye under the microscope. And we're able to see the layers of tissue and cells that are within the retina, for example. And this is something that we would see later on in the course. And then even smaller scale, cytology. In lecture, we would discuss the cells of the eye. And you may have heard of the rods and cones. These are the cells in our retina that detect light. So a systemic approach, we'll be able to study the cytology in lecture, the histology in lab, and the gross anatomy in lab for each of these 11 organ systems. Physiology, we want to point out here. This is, of course, another branch of biology. We just described how anatomy, of course, is the study of structure. A highly related subject now is physiology. And physiology, as we see here, is now the study of the functions and activities of organs, tissues, and cells. So it's truly the function, the working of these organs, tissues, and cells. And the reason why we want to bring up this definition for physiology is because we're going to see how the function is highly related to the structure. The physiology is linked to the anatomy. And the description we see here. So the anatomy of any organ, some structure, and you can think about just the shape of that particular organ, the location within the body, the structure even at the chemical level, so which elements, which molecules make up that structure. Everything about the anatomy has evolved to carry out some physiology, to carry out some purpose. And just one example would be right here, and we'll explain this. So we can think about the anatomy of our ribs. So the shape of our ribs, they're contouring around your chest wall. That position, of course, well, the position of the ribs, they're surrounding your delicate internal organs, such as your lungs. So that physical position and also the makeup of your ribs, the strong calcium-rich bone structures, make them very hard and rigid. Everything about the shape, position, and structure of the ribs helps to protect your internal organs. So we see how all of that anatomy is carrying out some specific function. So this is just one example. Here's just another example about the divergence of blood vessels. Arteries start at your heart and travel away and carry blood away from the heart. And all of the branching, diverging paths help us to distribute blood to our vascular tissues. Here's just one example from the kidney, what's known as a nephron. We'll study this much later. And I just want to reference that in our body, we have these two different types of nephron shapes. And that difference in their anatomy, that difference in their structure, leads to a difference in their physiology. And a great example is the male reproductive system. There's an absolute vital need for the location of the male gonad, the testis, to be contained in this scrotum. The fact that it's found externally to the pelvic cavity, this is important for a male's fertility. And another good example of the location going along with the function, the structure of the penis. This allows for delivery of semen and thus the male gamete into the female reproductive system. So this structure carries out and fulfills that reproductive function. So now moving forward with another topic, we have what's called the levels of organization. And this is now just showing the building blocks that create the human body. So we notice here from the least complex, meaning the very simplest, smallest scale, and the spectrum moving up to larger and larger structures to the entire human body. So we want to learn this order, this sequence across here, and we'll describe this in further detail. But starting at the chemical level, and we'll reference this textbook figure here. So at the chemical level, we're of course describing just the major elements and molecules that make up our cell structures. Moving up one step from that, the cellular level. So this would be the level of cytology. So looking at an individual cell, and there's many different types of unique cells. Collections of cells coming together with their extracellular material, that makes a tissue. Multiple tissues interact to form an organ. And each organ of our body belongs to at least one organ system. And we just pointed out earlier that there are 11 organ systems, as you can see right here from this figure. And then all 11 of these organ systems interact to, of course, create the entire organism, in this case, the human body. So to add some notes to each of these levels, the chemical levels we just mentioned. So the major elements, and we'll spell out exactly which are the most common in our body, and the major molecules, such as protein and fat. The cellular level, individual cells, just a basic unit of biology, a basic unit of any living organism, starting with the cells. We have this description now for a tissue. You notice here collections of similar types of cells, multiple copies of similar types of cells with their extracellular material to make a tissue. So we're building up to a larger structure. And now multiple tissues unite to make an organ. So we notice the definition here. Organ must have a combination of different types of tissues. In fact, there has to be a minimum of at least 2 different types of tissues. 2 different types of tissues come together to make a very simple organ. And now each organ has its distinct physiology. So now each of these organs will fit into at least one organ system. There are some organs that belong to 2 different systems, and we'll see examples of those. But each organ belongs to at least one organ system. So now we'll have multiple organs working together. Keep in mind, each organ has its specific physiology. So now we have multiple organs working together that give a body-wide impact on our physiology. So you can imagine here, the cardiovascular system is a great example. Your heart's a pump. Your arteries and veins and capillaries are literally like the plumbing network. And your blood is the fluid in circulation. And having all of those parts working together allows us to circulate blood to all our vascular tissues. So multiple parts working together. And then lastly, with these 11 organ systems, all interacting in some way to build the entire human body. So now we have all of the functions of 11 systems working together to sustain our life and to continue our species through reproduction. So moving back to the smallest scale, and I just want to reference here, you can see the figures where they're coming from in the textbook. And if you have an older or newer edition, it might be off by a figure or two, but you have the figures here in the lecture. At the chemical level, we see the most common elements in the body: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And we'll just highlight those here: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So looking at our major molecules, that's really the basis of our life, the basis of our DNA and protein structures, made from principally those 4 elements. Whereas at the molecular level, a combination of atoms to make a molecule, and H2O is a great example. The most common molecule in our body is, of course, H2O, water. And all of biology takes place within water. So we see this here at the chemical level. And the last thing I want to note before we move on, whenever it comes to the percentages and figures, I have the ones that I want you to commit to memory boxed in. So you notice here for the hydrogen, the 62%, and the oxygen, about 26% of our elemental composition. And then again here, water, we're about 2/3 water, especially earlier in life. The younger we are, we're more fluid. So now the next step after chemical level, we want to step up one to cellular level. And again, throughout lecture, we'll study various types of unique cells in the body. And in the lab soon, we'll have a review of just the basic organelles of a cell. After that, moving up to the level of tissue. And here's an image taken from a microscope. So a stained, chemically treated image of what's called smooth muscle tissue. Moving up from there, organs again. A combination of at least 2 different types of tissues can make a very simple organ. Each organ has its own function. And before we move forward into the organ systems, we have here in the textbook just the definitions of living processes, so the vital functions of living organisms. And I'd like you to use your textbook and look these up for yourself here. So I'll give you just a brief definition, but responsiveness, we have a nervous system and we're able to detect stimulation in the environment and respond to that. You know, if something's painful, we'll have that response to withdraw or pull away. Growth, of course, we're born and we're able to develop and enlarge our tissues as we grow over time, of course. And differentiation, our stem cell function. Using our stem cells, they can now make copies of themselves and then develop into distinct, unique types of cells. Reproduction, of course, we're able to create new life. So with the production of our sex cells and the union of the sex cells, we can produce new humans, new life. In terms of movement, with our muscles and our skeleton, we're able to move and bend and flex our body and our flexible joints. Metabolism, so of course from the foods that we consume, we could break it down to the smaller scale nutrients. So we have that metabolic process to break down a material. And then we could also then use that to synthesize and create materials within our body. And this example here, excretion, well, we're able to release materials from our body, whether we excrete via urination, defecation, sweating. So we're able to release waste chemicals from our body and excess materials from our body. And this last one here, homeostasis, we're able to regulate multiple internal variables within our body. We could regulate our blood glucose levels. We could regulate our body temperature. So again, make sure you look that up and get a quick definition for each of these. So now moving forward with the systems, we've mentioned now a few times, we have 11 organ systems. So an example would be the muscular system, the skeletal system, the nervous system. Each organ system has a number of organs within. Your cardiovascular system, as we said, has the heart, blood vessels, and your circulating blood. Each organ has its own physiology. So each organ has a purpose. And then we have that cumulative effect of multiple organs working together to give the system its function. And this is now what we'll introduce is the functions, the principal functions for these 11 organ systems. All right, so here we're introducing the integumentary system, right? Our protective layers of skin, and that's truly its purpose. Right at the surface of our entire body, protecting all our deeper tissues, and also it's a way to store energy in terms of our body fat. Our skeleton is the basic support and frame structure for our body. So the other 10 systems are contained within or attached superficially onto our skeleton. And the muscular system, our muscles, of course, allow us to then move our body so we can bend and flex our joints and move our body. And muscles give off heat as well. So we could spell that out here. So the integument, this is referring to our skin, our hair, and our nails. And this is the first organ system that we'll study. And again, that superficial covering for all the other 10 systems. Right at the surface, we have that protective layer of our skin. This helps us to regulate our temperature. Think of sweating. We sweat to cool off to maintain our temperature. And we can store energy in our subcutaneous fat. And just a few examples of the functions for what will be our first organ system to study. The next system we'll move into is the skeletal system. So the bones of the skeleton, the basic frame and support structure of our body. And with our strong, rigid bones, we gave the example of the ribs protecting the lungs. There's a large number of minerals that are stored in our skeleton, and you always hear about the very important one, calcium. That's the deposit and reservoir for our calcium is in our skeleton, as well as our bone marrow. This is a source of producing our blood cells from our bone marrow of the skeleton. The third system we'll move into is the muscular system. And as I mentioned, this allows us to move our body so we can move our flexible joints. This helps us to maintain our upright standing posture on 2 feet, as well as I mentioned, producing heat. So your muscles use a tremendous amount of energy to contract, and a lot of that is expelled as heat. And when it comes to the muscular system, I just want to point out the specific tissue here, skeletal muscle tissue. And it's only skeletal muscle tissue that's involved in the muscular system, as opposed to other types of muscle tissues in our body. So we don't want to confuse skeletal muscle tissue being involved with the muscular system. And you want to think of biceps and triceps and hamstrings. But using just the term skeletal system, that's where we're referencing the bones of our body. And again, this will be covered on the first exam, the second exam, and then the third exam will take us right through. So now a few more systems here. We're seeing a cardiovascular system. So we want to think of this network of circulating blood, and we need this to physically transport materials around to our trillions of cells. So it's a physical transport system. Over here, we're seeing numerous organs that produce hormones, and any organ that produces a hormone fits into the endocrine system. And you can even see, you notice the heart here. The heart produces a hormone, and here's an example of an organ that belongs to two different systems. And that's typically the case with the endocrine system. There's a lot of overlap. And then, of course, the system that controls and responds to stimulation for all the systems is the nervous system, the one that controls all of our functions. So we'll start here and we'll group these two together, the nervous and the endocrine system, because both of these systems have the ability to stimulate the functions of other organs and other organ systems. So the comparison between the two, the nervous system, of course, the brain, the spinal cord, all the nerves, the nervous system has a very fast and immediate response to stimulation. So within milliseconds, our nervous system can respond and then dictate some response by controlling other organs of your body, other organ systems. So it's fast and immediate. The endocrine system, this is another control system for our body. The difference is now the function of the endocrine system has a much longer duration, whereas the nervous system is rapid and immediate. The endocrine system has a much longer lasting effect. It's slower to act, but has a longer lasting effect. And again, all endocrine organs have this key feature of producing hormones. But these are the two different control systems for the body. And we will study this much later on for the 5th unit, these two. The cardiovascular system, again, with our heart and our circulating blood, this is the way to just physically transport material around our body. So the air that we breathe into our lungs, that oxygen enters our bloodstream, and now we can then distribute that gas all throughout our vascularized tissues. So it's an internal transport network to physically move materials around our body. We'll see a few more examples here. So of course, from the foods that we eat, we can digest and break it down to get nutrients for our digestive system. Our respiratory system allows us to ventilate and draw air into our body, and that important function of bringing oxygen in. And here we're seeing the lymphatic system, such as the tonsils, the spleen. These are the organs that develop our immune function. So we notice here the lymphatic system, truly the organs, the anatomy of our immune system. So these organs house and produce large numbers of white blood cells to respond to, of course, infection, to fight off disease. The respiratory system, of course, with the trachea, the air passages, the lungs, the vital function of delivering air, and more importantly, oxygen into our body. And here's just a great example, of course. The respiratory system has to directly interact with the cardiovascular system. In some way, all of our systems work together. And here's just a direct example. And the digestive system, as we pointed out, starting with the foods that we consume, and we have our teeth to just physically tear and break down into food, and our stomach, production of enzymes, so ultimately we could absorb nutrients from our food. So we could process it and break it down to the point where we could then start to absorb those nutrients into our bloodstream. And our last two systems represented here, We have the urinary system for that constant filtration of our blood, and that's the purpose, filtering our blood, maintaining various factors of our blood in proper level, and producing urine as a waste product. And the reproductive system, of course, there's the female and the male reproductive system. This allows us to, of course, produce new life, to continue our species by passing on our genetic information. So the urinary system, you want to think of the function of the kidneys, and with a constant blood supply, blood plasma flows into the kidneys, and then we're able to filter out waste chemicals, we're able to filter out toxins, excess materials, excess levels of materials, and ultimately produce that urine to excrete to remove those materials from our body. This is also a major way to can regulate our body's pH. And lastly, the reproductive system. So of course, with men and women, there's the production of sperm and the eggs, or the terms, the gametes, the sex cells. And this allows us to, of course, now produce a new human life to continue our species. And again, you see the example of the overlap with the endocrine system. The reproductive hormones also are produced by the reproductive organs. So those are the 11 systems we'll be studying during this course. So now we're going to move into the language of anatomy, and this will really continue right into our first lab activity as well. So starting out, we have just the anatomical language. It's based in Greek and Latin. It's a very old subject again, so it has its origins from that time era. So to begin, we'll bring up this term called the anatomical position. Our body is dynamic and flexible and movable, and there's just a chosen reference point. And it's important to have this common reference. So when we describe the locations of organs, when we describe the motions of muscles, we're all starting from that same frame of reference. So to see a figure of a body in the anatomical position, we could just go to this figure here, 1.8 in the textbook. And this is a human in the anatomical position. So we notice that we have a person standing upright, standing as opposed to, say, lying down, and all little distinct traits of their appendages and whatnot. We'll see that in lab. We have the terminology for the direction and location of various features. So instead of saying that something's above and behind and to the side, we'll go over this language in our first lab. We'll talk about the planes of section. Like anytime you see an MRI image, there's some distinct plane that image is taken in, and we'll go over this in the first lab activity. We have the body cavities, and the body cavities, these are the spaces within our body that are then filled with various organs. As an example, the cranial cavity, we're looking at the top part of the skull, and that's the location of our brain. So if we were to remove the bones of the cranial cavity, we would first see the brain. And if you were then to remove the brain, we'd be left with this hollow space called the cranial cavity. So these various body cavities contain and protect our delicate internal organs, and some of them actually allow for the organs to expand and constrict. So these dynamic, movable organs, such as your heart, the heart, of course, located in our chest. You see the precise term here called the pericardial cavity. And that allows for the heart to expand as it's relaxing and filling with blood. And then also it constricts as it's contracting, pumping blood. So we'll go through the details of the various body cavities. in the first lab activity. And concluding chapter 1 is here, what's known as a serous membrane. So serous membranes are located in many of our ventral body cavities. And this term, ventral body cavity, for the most part, means the torso. There's exceptions, of course. And we'll point out those exceptions in the first lab activity. But for now, ventral body cavity, you want to think of the torso. So the body cavities that are within our torso, many of these are lined by a serous membrane. The term serous means that there's a fluid secretion, a very watery liquid secretion that's produced by this membrane. And this fluid, it truly functions as a lubricant. So the organs themselves, as well as the walls of the body cavities, are coated in this watery secretion, and this protects the organs from friction. There's some moisture, so as your heart's expanding and constricting, it has this coating of this serous secretion, this coating of this lubricating secretion. So the particular names of serous membranes, we'll see more details in the first lab activity again. But for now, in our pleural cavities, we have what's known as the pleural membranes. In the pericardial cavity, again, the location of the heart, we have the paired pericardial membranes. So you see the name of the cavity and the name of the membrane go together. However, in the abdominal region, again, the abdominal region of our torso, we have what's known as the peritoneum. And that's one way to say it, is the peritoneum or the peritoneal membrane. And again, we'll describe this in more detail in the first lab activity.